Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the August 2023 webinar. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. I'm joining you from the land of the Yagara and Turrbal people. My name is Barbara Ryan and I'm the chair of EMPA. On behalf of EMPA, welcome to everyone. So today we're talking to Josh McLaren and Andrew McCullough. They're the voices behind the podcast Me, Myself and Disaster. Josh and Andrew both work in emergency management in their day jobs and are often seconded to PIO roles during events. They started the podcast in 2020 when they ran into an inspirational New Zealander, Ants Rowan, who'd found himself organising volunteers during the 2010 or just after the 2010 Christchurch earthquake. Since then, Me, Myself and Disaster has taken us around the world to consider disasters from every angle. So I'm hoping that we'll get to the comms angle today. So welcome, Josh and Andrew.
Thanks for having us, Barb.
Great to have you here. So you're both originally engineers. I'm really interested in what tipped you into emergency management.
Yeah, that's correct. I'll speak on both behalf, Andrew and I, in terms of the fact that, yeah, we both were engineers. We both studied engineering at university, and that was kind of our first lead into our careers. But I guess for me personally, it started a little bit earlier than that. I remember I was actually talking to my mum a couple of weeks ago. I said, where did I get my fascination for disasters from? Like, where did it stem from? And I think I always had this fascination with storms and natural hazards. And again, Andrew and I were actually talking about this when we were coming home from Sydney. As I said, we came to a massive storm. So I just love storms. I remember as a teenager chasing them with friends and going and looking at them and being fascinated by, how they happen, the disasters that can ensue after them, and being a bit of an adrenaline seeker. But I eventually kind of went into engineering and kind of lost that touch for disasters in that space, and thought, what I want to build. I originally want to be an actual architect. I think, Andrew, you were the same in terms of wanting to start as an architect, but eventually just fell into volunteering. I volunteered for the New South Wales SES here at the Kaima unit on the south coast of New South Wales. And just really fell in love with the whole world of disasters. And that's where mine and Andrew's relationship started. I actually had taken Andrew's role on secondment while he was off doing another role, and have just never looked back. For me, I have, as I've kind of matured through my career, have really understood how, working in a disaster sector really takes a diverse set of capabilities and skills to be successful. And one that I always talk to for me personally, I know Andrew talks to a lot as well, is as engineers, one of the key principles that you're taught at university is how to solve complex problems. And at the end of the day, that's what disasters are. And in engineering, they teach you how to kind of break them down to their smallest parts and components and work your way through a problem methodically and calmly. And I think that's really set me up well to work in the disaster space, especially in that public information space where, it is chaotic. There's chaos all around you, and you really need to just calm yourself down, work through the problem methodically, work out how you're going to communicate what you need to communicate and how you're going to communicate it, and then execute. What about you, Andrew?
Yeah, I think for me, I remember I was sitting in a structural design lecture at about third year university, and I was never a good engineer. Didn't like engineering. I just did it because I kind of thought like it wasn't architecture, and I just kept doing it. But I think so we did a lecture on how to design buildings to sustain cyclones and severe weather events, earthquakes. And for some reason, I really find that fascinating. That was my sort of turning point. And a friend at the time said, let's go and join the SES. So I did that. And I found, wow, there's so much to do in disaster management. But it's also more than that. There's like more than floods. There's major fires and the challenges that were ahead for us in terms of society dealing with these major disasters. That was super challenging. So I went and got a graduate job with Defence, moved to Canberra, thought that was my sort of next step in the career to get away from sort of just volunteering and doing something bigger picture, and I actually wanted to be an investment banker for a while there, and that sort of changed, I think, my impression of trying to make lots of money, do something that's actually going to be good for society. So I think about a year and a half into my Defence job, I left and got a temporary job with the SES, and again, never looked back at that either. I thought this is what I wanted to do, and it just seemed like the right thing, and studied a master's degree in disaster risk reduction. And I think it encompasses all the different challenges that we face as a society. It's so challenging, the work we do, and the real opportunity to change. We need good people in this space. We need to do challenging, solve big challenges, and this is where I guess it all starts. And I think there was a time there as a volunteer where I had to do a TV interview, and I thought, this is not too bad. I can do more of this sort of stuff. And I guess as we've evolved, I've now kind of done a lot more of that media and comm stuff. And as my first boss at SES kind of joked, that I'm now a social engineer, because I'm kind of pushing out different things to change community behaviour rather than trying to build buildings.
So what was the motivation behind the original podcast with ants? How did that come about?
Yeah, this one's a little bit of a nostalgic conversation. Again, something that we were only reflecting on not that long ago around, because as you said, 2020 was when we started this podcast. So it's been just on 3 years now since the podcast in its inception, and just looking back on where we've come from and how we started. And I think it really was that visit to New Zealand. So Andrew and I, and as some people may be able to relate to on this call, we are hopeless sickos, and people call us disaster tourists. So that's how we started kind of traveling overseas. We were just fascinated by other countries and disasters that had happened, and I guess not from a perspective of the doom and gloom, but looking at how did communities respond, what happened in the community, what did governments do, how did they solve the problems? Because at that point we were working in the industry, and we really wanted to in ourselves had this desire to learn more and I guess develop ourselves. So the hopeless people that we are, we went and decided to travel and wrap our holidays around disasters. And that first one was New Zealand. So we went over to New Zealand, and just through some connections at work, we started, lining up some people to catch up with while we were over there, and some friends lined some things up. But one of the people that we met, and we went down to Christchurch and spent a day down there just walking around with the local government, with the local emergency management team that handled that disaster, and just listening to their stories, walking through the town and just pointing out some of the damage that had happened, some of the complexities of working with the community. How did they communicate through that time? How did they work with the community to help them understand what was happening, and then into recovery, and also learning about their recovery journey? And I guess from there, on our way home, we were kind of just sitting on the plane, and we're looking at each other, and we're like, how can we be selfish and have all these lessons to ourselves? We have just opened up such a valuable lesson and listened to so many stories and experiences that we as an industry need to be across. And that's where we literally were sitting on a flight on the way back from New Zealand. We said, hey, we should start a podcast. So we got back, COVID struck. And at that point, we kind of, all of our, as many people here would understand and remember through that time, all of our conferences stopped. A lot of that face-to-face interaction that we have as an industry started to stop. And that was really the driving force to us to go, hey, let's just try something. And from there, it's just, in a sense, snowballed. I think the industry has really latched on to this podcast because, and again, I don't think I'm speaking out of school here. There are some cultural challenges that we have in this industry about being siloed. And we do have some bents towards reinventing wheels in this industry sometimes. And I think that's where people have really latched onto this space and the stories and experiences we've been able to share, and take those away for them and go, well, what can I learn from that? But trying to be really practical as well around, okay, you might be a community recovery officer sitting in a local government, or you might be someone working for an emergency management agency, or you might be someone working in policy and government, but there are lessons for everyone to take away from these podcasts. What was the first thing for you?
Yeah, I think very similar, Josh, in terms of, I really am fascinated by spontaneous volunteers. If I know secret, who knows me, is that I really find the community mobilisation element really fascinating. And seeing in New South Wales and Australia what we've done here, but also you learn things when going overseas. And I learn a lot in my sort of, foundational years of being, starting as an emergency management person in the SES, and going to AFAC conferences, places like the EMPA conference, the one on the Gold Coast. You learn so much from hearing from different speakers about these different elements of what they're doing, different projects and the innovative things they're doing. But I think there's people who can't go to those. And then during COVID, we couldn't go to them at all. And there's also so much work that crosses over that's of interest. I talked to my engineering mates who I went to uni with, and they're doing things like dealing with landslides and dealing with some of the complications of disasters. And they're going, well, I'm involved in disaster management as well, and for that longer term recovery stuff. So there's a common thread there, I guess, in terms of like disasters ensue so much of the world and so much of our lives in terms of what we do, that we found that so fascinating. But also, how do we attract, given the challenges we're facing, how do we attract more people to this space? People fall into emergency management often because they were a volunteer or they were impacted by a disaster, or they kind of, no one leaves university going, I want to be a disaster manager, or I want to work in emergency management. So how do we kind of share that story and I guess give people an insight into some of the different roles that exist, and the different type of work that exists in this sector that people might be considering in the future do that work in that space.
And I think to a degree, Barb, the motivation has kind of evolved. I guess very much sitting on that plane on the way home from New Zealand, it was all about, how do we share stories? How do we share experiences? But as we've kind of gone on this journey and we've built this tool, we've actually realized that it has a lot of opportunity to do good in the industry. So I think now it's kind of evolved from, yes, we still love to tell stories. We still love to share experiences of people that have gone through disasters and what they've learned from them. But also, as Andrew was kind of saying there, now we really look for some of those common threads in our stories around, okay, well, how can we create industry pathways? We all know here that, disasters are becoming more intense, more frequent, compounding, cascading. The disaster landscape around us is changing. But the problem is the industry's not changing with it. We need to change with it. We need to increase the amount of people that work in this space. So that's been very much a key motivation for the podcast over the last year, is around, how do we actually create industry pathways? It's like the same conversation we're having with diversity and looking at how do we get more, females into the boardroom. People have got to see themselves in those positions. They've got to see representation in those positions. And it's the same thing we're trying to do here, is create representations for people who might be working in the insurance industry or as engineers, but can actually see how their skills and their capabilities can transfer across sectors. And I guess, lastly, the last motivation, I think it's probably been our real driver for the last 6 months with a lot of the stuff that you've seen, from the UN and things around the acceleration in climate change, is, well, what do we need to be doing for the future? And it's a question you'll hear us ask a lot of our guests is, what next? What do we need to be doing now to prepare ourselves for the future, and trying to give the industry that kind of glimpse into that lens around what work we need to be doing moving forward.
And I will just add to that, I think, too, just quickly, that I think the communications element, having a podcast, and we now have a YouTube channel that's sort of getting more involved in the video space, is giving those people a voice who can't sort of share their story. I think some of those people who we've spoken to, we've spoken to a great guy on the coast, Greg Webb, who his house was destroyed by a bushfire. He's a great sort of media speaker now, and he's very sort of confident in the way he sort of talks. But people like that, we want to share their story, because I think it wasn't getting out, and he's doing such amazing work in his house to rebuild after the bushfire with a house that's going to be bushfire safe and far more resilient. There's people around the world that we've spoken to, and we don't have the biggest audience compared to, say, the BBC or CNN, but things like the Pakistan floods and the stuff that's going on in Afghanistan at the moment, that sort of work, the Pakistan floods got a little bit of media attention at the start, and then it's kind of died, and people lost interest in that sort of thing, that wasn't affecting Australia. But these are global crises that are causing major distraction to people over there who are just losing their livelihoods and their homes, getting washed away, and they're isolated for months on end. And we don't kind of give it the same level of importance here in Australia that it probably deserves. So I think there's lessons to learn from that, but I think having the platform of a podcast gives a bit more sort of emphasis, and hopefully helps people in this space understand what's happening in that broader world that they might not have time to sort of go into their own research or learn about, or find it in the traditional media where it normally would be.
Yeah, okay. I want to come back to the threads idea, but we've got a question here from Michael. Josh, you refer to the disaster sector as an industry. Is that the right description for something that involves all communities everywhere, not just professionals or workers?
Yeah, look, it is a great question, Michael. And I think, we Andrew, this is the same conversation. Language is important. As communicators, we know how important language is when we talk with people, when we communicate ideas. The language we use is very, very important. And a classic example of that, and you'd see Andrew and I have done a few podcasts on it, and we've also done some YouTube videos to help people explain in their own in their own workplaces, is the whole conversation around no natural disasters. And you'll have a lot of people that come to you and go, oh, it's just semantics. And it's like, no, it's not just semantics. It actually is really, really important that we're careful of our language. And I think you're right, Michael. We need to have how do we refer to our space moving forward? Because I think in the past, and this is probably my own bias, and thank you for calling me out on it. We've thought about it as an industry as being professionalized, but we now know that the answer to disasters is a whole of society collective response. So what is the word that we use to refer to that? I don't have the answer for that, and hence why I probably use industry. And in my head, that language and that context throws a lasso around all of it. But you're 100% correct that we need to be really careful. And again, like, what is the future language that we need to be using? If this is going to become a sector that's growing, how do we communicate in that sector around who we are and what we do?
That could be a job for EMPA, I think.
It could be.
So let's go back to the threads idea. I was really interested in like that conversation around developing the industry as a byproduct of your podcast is something that hadn't occurred to me listening to your work. But what other threads have come out that have made you think about bigger picture things as you've gone along?
I think, and I'd say the Greg Webb podcast we did at Lake Conjola was probably one of those ones that really made us think, and it got a really big reaction too, because it was someone that showed how his life has changed significantly. And I guess we've interviewed people who are those impacted by the disasters, those who manage disasters, those who work in the disaster landscape across the board. And I think, as I said before, there's that real thread that people just fall into this industry without any sort of pathway to get there. They just kind of find themselves working in this space or volunteering in this space, either directly involved or they have some sort of role that works in disasters when disasters happen. I think that's probably a key one, but also the life-changing nature of disasters. And I think it sort of sets people in a different direction. It changed their life, and I don't mean that lightly. I think they really do change their life as a result of this. We spoke to Ash Carl, so he's the deputy head, or he was deputy head of the UN Migration Agency in Afghanistan. And for me, that was really, I guess, changing perspective of what I sort of took from that conversation, because it was just such a multi-dimensional disaster that really impacted everything. They had no media attention. There was little interest from the Western world. Ukraine was kicking off at that point. We spoke to him. And it was quite frustrated because there was just so much happening in Afghanistan in terms of it was coming on to wintertime, issues with famine, massive flood risk and flash flood risk for people in Afghanistan who were torn apart already by the war, the changing political nature of the leadership in Afghanistan as well, and the challenges around vulnerable people and women and girls and issues around gender. And you kind of see that the common thread there is that there is a lot of other issues on the periphery around Afghanistan, but it's the natural hazards that can really tear everything apart. People are just holding on as they are, but if there's any sort of sense of flooding or a drought that causes famine, the whole world falls apart. And that's, unfortunately, didn't get the attention in Australia apart from sort of the initial sort of media attention, but it was something that I know Ash is very passionate about. He's now moving to a different job in Rwanda, which is fascinating. And we'll keep in touch with him for another podcast and track what happens there. But hearing, I guess, that although we think of disasters in Australia as sort of the combat agencies and the recovery agencies and local councils and all those different groups, I guess it's really opened our minds going overseas and seeing this in action, seeing what the UN does and seeing all these different agencies, the humanitarian work that happens. So much of it is around problems around things like homelessness or poverty, but the root cause here is obviously like social issues, but so much of it is escalated and exacerbated by the risk of a natural hazard based disaster occurring.
Yeah, I think that, like, for me, that's probably been one of the strongest things. It's something that you learn a lot about in academia, that, like, around, the hazard and the exposure and the vulnerabilities. But I think for us, seeing that play out on the ground has been really interesting and really kind of proving that idea that, disasters are the nexus of all things. They are the thing that, exacerbates existing stresses and other things in community. But I think for me, one of the other key kind of threads that I've learned throughout all of our podcasts is that communicators are one of the keys to unlocking the door. I think we talk a lot about in the emergency management space about, the operations, the lights and sirens, getting out there and fixing the problem. But you can't do any of that without communicating. And in all of our stories, we've heard how people have had to use communication to overcome to overcome hurdles. And it's been really interesting watching that across multiple different sectors. But people that don't necessarily would say that they're a communicator or that they work in this profession, kind of going, well, no, you are a communicator. We had Richard de Crespigny on, and I dare say we'll dive into that a little bit deeper in this webinar. But there's a classic example, a pilot who now has found himself in an industry and is so passionate about communication. And he started as a pilot, and the disaster was the trigger point for him to understand what communication meant, how do you use it, and how do you use it to kind of manage disasters moving forward.
I wanted to add to that as well. I think certainly what we talk about in Afghanistan, and what we saw about some other podcasts, is some sort of isolated issues, but they're representative of a huge issue on the ground. And I think the way we communicate about these things potentially is a difference between it getting funding or not. And a lot of these different things, the way we communicate is so important. We saw that around the world in our travels and who we've been speaking to, that it's a lot of these issues are issues that aren't getting attention, probably deserve more attention, but it's often the loudest in the room, or those with the most resources to be able to communicate about it and get the government grants or get the international attention, really leads to actually having something done about it.
It's also interesting, Barb, that, and it's just kind of popped into my head now that you've kind of asked this question and had some time to kind of think about it as well, is that the funny thing is when you look at a disaster, you kind of don't understand, like you kind of oversimplify it sometimes. In Australia, I think sometimes we oversimplify disasters and we put it in a box and go, okay, the fires happened and that was that incident, and we move on. I think something we've learned traveling around the world, because when you go overseas and you go global, you kind of understand more around that humanitarian lens as well. And as Andrew was saying before, like it's all of those things that are wrapped around a disaster that create that complexity. But at the end of the day, when you boil it right down, it is the same principles. It is the same principles about what was the hazard, what was the exposure of that hazard, and what were the vulnerabilities that were interacting in that environment when it all happened. You can boil any disaster anywhere around the world down to some of those three key principles and really start to unpack quite a complex problem and start to understand it. And no matter whether you're in Australia or Japan or Thailand or Afghanistan in a high conflict area, some of those threads, we see them through every single story. And that's why, again, it's so important that as people working in this industry, we really understand those interactions.
Yeah, so the commonalities in the communication side of things, are they reflected by commonalities in human reactions to disaster across the cultural sort of differences?
I think that is a really interesting question. I think there are some things that I would say are common expectations. So one thing that we've seen through a lot of stories, but also in our own work in the industry, working as public information officers, is the community expectation for transparency. So like for me, in every story that we've had, in every person we've spoken to, the importance of transparency and people openly communicating about what's going on is so important in terms of how we actually communicate with people and communities during disasters. I think that's, for me, is the biggest thing. No matter whether in Thailand during the tsunamis and you're looking at these impoverished communities living on the coast versus some of the things that we see here in Australia through quite wealthy communities, there is that, even though you're seeing people on the different scales of the demographics and the social demographics, we see the same thing, is that craving for transparency. It's like this human, I don't know, it's the whole trust thing. Like, you can't communicate without trust, and you can't communicate and have trust if you're not transparent. And that's one of the key things I've seen through our travels.
Yeah, no, I don't really agree.
Yeah, okay. Marcus has got a question here about heat waves, and you've just done a podcast about heat waves. So his question was about the unfolding and slow movement disasters like heat waves. So we're probably going to be doing more of those as communicators as we go along. Can you have a chat about that?
Well, I think, yeah, that's something. The heat wave was one we wanted to cover, so we're both in Asia early this year, and there was that heat wave, I think it was around April, May. And I think it was described as the worst Asian heat wave in history, and it was horrendous. I was up in northern Thailand, and it was just like it never stopped. And you go, people, like, on a plane to come back to Australia, people live with this all the time. And I was sitting in an air-conditioned hotel. People don't have that access or that liberty that I had. But then look at places like Europe and the US. And in the US, it was like, well, we interviewed this researcher from Johns Hopkins University, who's an expert in heat wave. Really interesting discussion, but talking around how this is something we can change now. And there's things we can do around people living in these row homes in places like Baltimore, where they're just in the same old house. They rent from these sort of places. And I guess, I don't know how you describe them in Australia, but those sort of similar houses where you're in a row of houses, every house is the same, and they come with a black roof and you just live in that. And he was saying there's things that we can do now, but there's these wicked problems of the roof is black. You want to get a white roof, but you rent the place, so you can't do it. Your tenant, your landlord's got no interest in doing it. So you're stuck in this challenge. And I think it's been proven it's about 3 or 4 degrees difference living in a house with a white roof. So simple things we can do now to avoid this sort of stuff is so difficult to deal with. And places in places like Arizona, where they have these deserts that are just so hot, they're going to get even hotter. And the landscape's going to change. The people and their activities need to change. Work needs to change around, do you go to work in the middle of the day? And how do you sort of change that around? So I think comms has a massive role to play this. But these are systemic issues. They're the huge issues that cut through society around how do you actually sort out cost of living pressures at the moment, and thinking of things around even running the air conditioner for some people in the US is beyond what they can afford at the moment to get through some of these heat waves. And so this will become worse and worse every year. I'm sure we need to have some sort of bigger solution to it.
I think one of the things which was really interesting talking to Dr. Benzychek is that there's a reason why when they communicate they use the term silent killer, because it's not something that is visible, because most of the deaths that happen from heat waves are, in a sense, comorbidities. So you might have an existing health situation that is then exacerbated by the heat, and the heat becomes that trigger to tip you, in a sense, as an individual over the edge and causes the fatality. And I think that was the really interesting thing for Andrew and I, is that I think people, again, it comes down to a communication element, and it comes down to language and semantics, is that, when we talk about heat, your first thought in your head is not about disaster, is it? It's like, oh, it's a great day to go to the beach. So for us, we need to, how do we as communicators shift that language and help people actually understand the risk that sits around these heat waves? I think the scariest thing for me, Marcus, around the heat wave space is that, like we talk about a lot of hazards, in terms of what we saw with the floods and then COVID and then bushfires, this notion of compounding and cascading events. You can almost apply that same concept in the heat wave space, because what we're seeing is globally, we've seen it all on the media, the rise in disease and other things around our diets and a whole range of lifestyle choices. And we're seeing that on an exponential curve. But then if you actually put the exponential curve on in terms of climate change, some environments are getting hotter and hotter and hotter. You now actually have a really scary graph that you're looking at in terms of the scale of the problem that you're looking at, that you're facing. And I think it's something that if you don't look at it, a lot of governments, they're not looking at it now, or if they're agencies that aren't planning for it, they're going to become unstuck very quickly.
Hey, so of the podcast you've done, is there a standout in terms of communication being the star or the villain?
Oh, good question.
I've got a couple of villains. Villains I can think of. So there's an article someone sent me a few years ago, which I found really interesting. It was about the Paradise Fire. So Paradise is a place, I think it's near LA, massive fire. And we interviewed a freelance journalist called Colleen Haggerty. So Colleen's really writes on Medium and other different websites. She works at the BBC sometimes, and she's now has even a newsletter about disasters called My World's on Fire. So you can check it out if interested. Really interesting sort of person that talks about disasters now, and found a lot of fascination in the preppers in America and those sorts of things. Anyway, so she was looking at a whole paper or an article about Facebook groups and how in a disaster, I'm sure we've all seen it, people get together, they want to help each other. Initially, they're very sort of passionate about helping each other to get things done. All of a sudden, the Facebook group imploded, and people were sort of like, saying, oh, how did that person get the donation? How did this person, why do they deserve this? Or like sort of there's a whole heap of like nasty community elements that came out as a result of that. And so I think it required a lot of leadership to get that back on track, and those sort of community elements. It's fascinating to me, to kind of from a spontaneous volunteering perspective, but also hearing her her thoughts, I guess, on how that kind of unfolded, and how a community across that kind of the grief curve of disaster, how the communication style changed, and how the community started to sort of eat itself alive when they got to a point where they were sort of in that recovery phase and they weren't getting what they wanted. It's unfortunate that it happened, but I think that sort of the use of Facebook groups now is becoming very common during disasters, even though there are those sort of formal channels. I know Facebook's using that crisis response tool. It always comes back to those informal Facebook groups and people having some sort of control over the message, but it ends in sometimes unfortunate ways. Maybe a more positive story.
Well, I think I have two. I think one for in terms of that more traditional communication that we see. I think one of the biggest heroes that I've seen is Richard de Crespigny, and some of you may know Captain Richard de Crespigny through his story of landing the Qantas flight in November 2010 in Singapore, where basically an engine exploded, caused catastrophic damage to the airframe and all of the systems on board. And Richard has some really amazing stories around. Obviously, there was a lot going on, and he was dealing with the crisis with his hands in terms of flying the plane and the systems. But what's really interesting is the role that communication played in him managing that disaster. Not only, I guess, with the people on the plane. So he talks about this fascinating story around how, when he communicated, I was talking about this before, around that trust and that transparency. He decided in the moment, rather than just talking to his air crew or the flight attendants in the back through private channels, he decided that any direction or any information he gave to his crew, that the whole plane deserved to know that. So whenever he communicated across the whole PA system across the plane. So at every single point, everyone who was in that boat with him, or that plane, knew about what was going on. He built that trust and that credibility with those people. And then he talks about this fascinating story around that the disaster just didn't finish when he hit the ground. There was this whole kind of communication element that then took place around, okay, well, how do you maintain credibility for the brand Qantas? And he talks a lot about how the trust and what he leveraged off through the incident in the air actually provided him credibility then to communicate with people on the ground. And it's a fascinating story. If you're a communicator, I guess that's one episode you should be going and listening to, because again, just he talks about like tone and body language and about an element where if you don't actually understand, most times if this happens in a foreign country, you're a foreign pilot, the first thing they do is detain you. And he knew that if he got detained, there was no way that he could handle the situation. There was no way he could communicate with the passengers and his other crew after the fact. So he talks a lot about, the tone and the body language he used when he hopped off the plane and how important that was as a turning point in the crisis. But I think a more somber one as well is around how do we use communication to share lessons? And I think one that really hit me and, brought tears to my eyes when we were in Japan was the school in Japan, in Ishinomaki, and how Japan, in terms of keeping ruins and wrecks. Most countries, what's the first thing they do if there's like a ruin or a wreck? It's okay, let's bulldoze it and build something. We need to get rid of it, get rid of the pain. We need to basically, in a sense, erase this and build it new. But what Japan's actually done is said, no, these are hard lessons and hard stories that we need to remember, that we need to keep in our mindsets, and we need to communicate with our communities so this never happens again. So when you actually go over to Japan, up into the north, you'll actually see there's a lot of buildings on the close to the coastal areas that they've never demolished, because they say that in 10, 15, 20 years, when people have moved on and can't tell that story, what they want those buildings and those reminders to communicate what happened there, so that people will never build there again and will never make the same mistake. So I think, for me, they're two kind of hero standouts that are really powerful. I think the Ishinomaki one really hit home because, I have 4 kids myself, and talking about the struggles and the battles that multiple schools in that area and the many children that lost their lives. It's a hard thing to go and sit with and see and be communicated to about. But they do it in a very honest and open way that is a way that you kind of go, I understand that you're here and the tone is for me to learn a lesson. And so it kind of enables people to actually open up and have some of those conversations.
I just thought another villain I wanted to sort of share. And it's probably driving down. I was in the Gold Coast during the Lismore floods or the Northern Rivers floods, and I got in one of those taxis or the like transfer buses down to Lismore from the Gold Coast, and the driver for an hour and a half lectured me about how he saw crop dusting planes and chemtrails. It was the government forcing the rain to happen and floodwaters. It was all caused by the government. And I'm sitting there in my uniform, just listening, going, okay, great. But I think we heard a lot about conspiracy theories during COVID and the vaccine and the pandemic, and it just generated a lot of community conspiracy theories. So we interviewed a professor in a university in America, Joe Uzinski, who is an expert in conspiracy theories. And it was really fascinating talking to him about the belief in conspiracy theories, and particularly around disasters. And I think he mentioned it was like 70% of people believe in some sort of conspiracy about the JFK assassination. About 5% believe in a conspiracy about the chemtrails, which I find like even more interesting. But even worse, about 4% of people believe in some sort of reptile lizard race that actually runs the world, and they believe that sort of exists. And so these conspiracy theorists are out there. And he did mention something about 5 years ago when he first got into this space, he set up a Google alert and was getting about 3 or 4 emails a day for news articles around conspiracy theories. During the pandemic, there was about 100 a day of conspiracy theorist articles. So listen to him talking about, he calls them conspiracy theorists are losers, in terms of not losing the traditional sense, but they're people who are often down and out, or they're sort of outside of power. They don't have the power, they don't have the sort of the wealth to kind of consider legitimacy of some things, and they're always kind of thinking of, I've been hard done by, I've lost something. When they've lost something, they've been outside of the sort of society, then they start to develop conspiracy theories about things. And we've seen ourselves in disaster. That example, like the first-hand example I gave around being in the Northern Rivers and hearing that, is a real challenge for communicators in these sort of times. I think I saw DFES recently post a really good page, I think it was DFES, around fact-based and sort of myths and myth-busting in terms of disasters. Was it DFES?
No, FEMA. So FEMA was really interesting. Yeah. FEMA out of the Maui fires. Obviously, many people here have probably been following the news and following the story over there. But given that some of the locations like Maui are quite remote, you don't have government officials out there being able to, in a sense, I don't like the word control, but in a sense, myth bust and be, have two sides to every conversation. So what they actually have done is set up a website where they just post all of the myths that they're hearing and have stepped out the facts as well. And anyone can go to that. So it's about, and as Andrew says, Joe talks about people in a sense, they've worked out what are the types of individuals, demographic, where they are socially, where they sit in community, basically primes them for conspiracy theories. So FEMA's kind of been doing some work around, well, if you move that barrier of access to information, hopefully you can combat some of that conspiracy theories in communities that, as we all know, sometimes actually harm the overall effort of what we're trying to do in communities in terms of getting them back on their feet and helping them through their worst days. Well, I think you're
sorry, guys.
Barb.
You'd think after 10 years on Zoom, anyway. Do you think there's a role for pre-bunking in disaster management then?
Yeah, I think given what Joe talked about, there's definitely I think a considerable effort into going to some of these sorts of things, and I guess sort of immunising ahead of time to kind of talk about what we're going to do and to make it very clear. And I think we often don't want to consider conspiracy theories. Just go, no, the chemtrails are just crazy. Don't even talk about it. But sometimes it's worth kind of saying whatever happening. I mean, I'm sure there were no crop dusters at all flying over the Northern Rivers at that time. It was pouring down rain and it was very unlikely. But I think being upfront about what happened is maybe a useful thing. The conspiracy theory stuff is very interesting, though. There's a lot of challenges to it. I think he basically said you cannot. Once someone goes down in that rabbit hole, it's very hard to pull them out and convince them. And sometimes they're basically a lost cause, unfortunately.
Yeah, I was just about to say. I think the really interesting thing is that, as Andrew said, I think a lot of the time in this industry we dismiss that because we do operate from a space of fact most of the times, and that's who we are, and we know that builds trust and credibility. But understanding that the problem is far more complex, and it's not just that this person's silly. There are actually a set of triggers and situations sitting behind that individual that have led them to get to that point. It's not as simple as just saying, brushing them off. It's about, no, actually understand what's driving this person to think this. and you need to look at how you combat that. And as Andrew, I've just said before, around, disaster next to all things, and we know that, certain social issues and where financially people are, that drives them or predetermines or pre-exposes them to disasters. The same thing, conspiracy, understanding what those drivers are. Maybe we need to look at some work around how we work with people before that in those cohorts to help them kind of understand where you access information, what are the trusted sources, and help them work through it.
And Joe said to us at the time, publishing this podcast could be risky. We'd get some sort of negative feedback, and we did. Like on Twitter, I know we got attacked for posting about conspiracy theories, and people sort of saying, "Oh, this is a load of rubbish. Like these things are real. Like there is, like JFK was like whatever conspiracy theory, or there are lizards running the world, or Hillary Clinton's got a Pizzagate thing going on." Like people actually believe these things. And that was directed towards us. We've been publishing a podcast about it. So yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We had a speaker at EMPA New Zealand last year, Saab Jahal, who is a psychologist who went into why people become conspiracy theorists. And he said it basically comes down to they don't feel they belong anywhere. They're seeking a feeling of belonging. But I just wanted to go back to the Paradise Fires. That breakdown of the community communication. I'm just wondering how much that was caused by a lack of communication by the relief and recovery agencies. Were they communicating well in parallel with that while all that was happening, or was that one of the reasons that sort of breakdown happened within that community?
Yeah, I think from memory it was sort of too slow, and I think and this is only from my memory and recollection of the podcast a couple of years ago, but I think and in terms of spontaneous volunteering and community mobilisation, often it happens in the absence of getting that service or that news from somewhere else. And so we've seen that in Australia in disasters, is people, when there's a vacuum or they don't have what they need, then they start getting active and bring the community together. And I think these Facebook groups are exactly that, where there's something that they're not receiving, there's a service that they don't have or information they don't have. And then someone in the community steps up to take that role of being the communicator and saying, well, here are the places to get food and water, or I'm going to open my home to people who need accommodation. And that Facebook group becomes that meeting place or the town hall for that discussion to happen. And so I think in that particular incident, there was, I guess, the communication wasn't there from the authorities in terms of what needs to be what the community needs to know. And I think it's often easy for us as emergency managers, to say, well, this is our remit. Like, we look after this particular part of the disaster. And the community says, well, actually, that's not important to us at the moment. We want this. And so it's easy for us as government to kind of go, well, this is what needs to happen. But at some point, the community element and the community-led approach and involving the community is also really important to understand, I guess, what's important to them and make sure we're communicating that, because I think there's a lot of crossover between the spontaneous volunteering space and the mobilised communities and those Facebook groups where people have now got an avenue that can easily get a vocal audience, and they can get power quite quickly through online channels that they couldn't have got 20 years ago. So it really comes down to being really, I think, a really strategic plan early about how we communicate to these groups that are really in a state of crisis.
I think as well, it's that point of integration and how do you lean into that? Because I think that was some of the comments in terms of one reaction is when it starts to go pear-shaped is people often, hands off, or we'll step away. And that's totally the wrong thing to do. The thing to do is actually to lean into that space. And I think partly as well, something that we've really got to think about as professionals is how do we integrate into those spaces? Because at the end of the day, community have agency. Community should be having these conversations with themselves. That is in itself resilience, but it's about how do we as, government agencies, people working in this space integrate into that and empower and support rather than trying to control and manage.
Yep. Okay. Got a question from Marcus Barber here on your thoughts on how we can get further ahead in the timeline from a response phase to a pre-response mindset.
I think a lot of these things are not unexpected. So it's like and I keep saying spontaneous volunteers because it's my personal passion, but it's the same with these Facebook groups. Like, this shouldn't surprise us as it's happening, because people wanted the information and it's always the same sort of things they're after. Every disaster is different, but they always ask the same sort of things around where can I get help, where can I get food and water, or my house is gone, or whatever else. So they're sort of the similar types of things. we have to plan for that now. So I used to work for Qantas back in the day. It's first job out of university. And they have a very detailed plan and approach of what happens in every sort of incident that could possibly happen. Every sort of, here's the wording around what happens here. And I found that quite fascinating. I wasn't working in media and comms, I was working in some other role, but it's really sort of, I think we can get ahead now by planning for every different scenario that could possibly happen, because the scenarios aren't that extensive. Being in touch with our communities and having that existing relationship with the community networks is also really important. So I think we've seen that. I think that's a lesson that's come out of the Paradise Fire, is that having the relationships with some of those groups and the community leaders. It's easy to sort of dismiss people for whatever their views are, but I think the loudest people now have a really clear voice through social media, and it can't be easily ignored. So I think just planning ahead is probably the simplest answer to that.
I think as well, we often think of ourselves as communicators as an external job. We're always communicating out. But I think a real shift in my mindset, and it was when we actually had an individual that was talking about the no natural disaster, and we asked the campaign, and we asked Craig Fugate this as well, is the importance of actually internally communicating. And I think one of the biggest things that we need to look at is, how do we actually communicate inwards? We as communicators, we have this skill set. We understand how to package things up into narratives and talk to people. And we practice that skill outwards and to our communities. But how are we influencing the conversation internally? And we asked this of Craig Fugate around, okay, we've got a lot of people coming into this industry. How are we influencing leaders and decision makers in our agencies to change their mindset and to think about preparedness and planning rather than response and recovery? How can we actually stop the problem from ever happening? And that's quite a big mind shift, right? And I think we're slowly going on that as an industry. You'll see a lot of work coming out of NEMA, starting to come out of NEMA, looking at, okay, well, how we invest upfront rather than after the fact. And there's lots of work happening in that space. But I think it's really about, how do we effectively communicate internally in our agencies to bring these conversations to the forefront? And if we're not doing it, who's doing it? So I think really the solution starts with us as individuals in our agencies, because we at the end of the day, we're all leaders. We all can influence something in our agency. Might be something small. You might not be the commissioner of an agency that can change the whole thing with a click of a finger. But if you spark one conversation or you challenge one bias, that's a start. That's the journey we need to go on moving forward.
So we're about 10 minutes out of finishing. So please put some questions up, because we'll be running out of time soon to get them answered. But I'm just wondering, Andrew and Josh, where to next? What are you hoping to do with the podcast, and what types of people are you hoping to get on?
I think I'd love to speak to more people who've been impacted by disaster and that true story on the ground. So we're kind of veering away from heads of agencies and those sorts of things that already have a voice to speak, and they have that kind of communication power. But people who don't have that element, and like we're in Japan and Thailand just recently and talking to people there. We went to the Fukushima place where the nuclear disaster happened. That was quite fascinating. There'll be a video coming pretty soon about that. But I think it's more of those sort of stories that we can see where there's lessons to be learned for Australia through that. And so the Maui, as Josh mentioned earlier, the Maui wildfires, certainly for us, is something we'd love to get to pretty soon when it's the right and appropriate time to do so. Because there's a lot of lessons around the way that was communicated and the warnings that went out to that community, the way that community responded, and particularly the way they responded together and they're recovering together in the absence of anyone else. So I think that's a really fascinating area. But certainly some travels on the cards for next year, and exploring some other topics as well to sort of challenge the thinking that we have in Australia. Things around volcanoes, for example, I'm really keen to sort of consider what that means. And I know there's people who believe there's volcanoes that could erupt in Australia at some point, which is pretty scary, but it's a reality of the world. And also I think traveling to Asia, I think I've been 3 times in the last 6 months, been fascinated to kind of understand that we're in this Asia Pacific area that is so disaster prone. And so there's a lot happening, and we're almost in a little bubble here in Australia sometimes in the way we operate around disasters. Our disasters are relatively benign in terms of the number of deaths and the challenges we face because we're a wealthy nation. Sure, we have vulnerable people, but it's nothing like the Philippines when a typhoon goes through those parts of the world. So there's plenty of lessons to be learned. We've spent plenty of time in Bangkok, and we're in the Philippines and some other parts in Vietnam, and see what happens there where there is major disasters and a whole range of challenging social issues. And the nexus of those is really interesting, but also what are the lessons that we can bring back to Australia? Because I mean, there's plenty of those. Just need to run it past Josh's wife to get out of the house, but I think we're definitely keen to go and do that next year.
Yeah, I think for us, it really is, Barb, around what, Andrew and I are really committed to this mission around, what do we need to be doing for the future? I think that's one thing that really drives and stokes the fire inside of us, is being a part of something bigger than what we can do as individuals and what we can do as a collective. So I think you'll see over the next probably 12 to 18 months, a lot of these stories are going to be future focused. What can we learn from now, and how do we prepare for the future is really going to be some of those key messages that we're trying to communicate. But also, I think we're almost seeing a tipping point. I feel like we're seeing a tipping point in terms of community. We've talked a lot about climate change, and it's been obviously a conversation in the background. But I think what you've probably seen the last 6 months as agencies like the UN and other bodies are really ramping up the communication. We are getting at a turning point. We are reaching that point of inflection that we need to be doing stuff now. So I think you also see from us a lot of, stories around, okay, well, how do you get involved in this? You might not work for a combat agency, or you might not work as a local emergency management officer, but hey, you working in the insurance industry, you actually have a role to play in this. You working in the education department, you actually have a role to play in this space, because we need a whole of collective society approach to disasters moving forward. We know they're getting larger, bigger. We know that they're affecting more and more parts of our society. So we need to have the solution that encompasses all of that.
And these people that you're hoping to reach in future, these ordinary people who just seem to rise to the occasion, you've interviewed a few of them in your past podcast. What do they have in common? What makes them the people that emerge from that particular situation?
Oh, that's a good question.
I think it's certainly people who, one, they've got the means to do so. Like they've got I think it's a certain group of people who they're very, very vulnerable, and these people who just sort of rise to the challenge. So they have the means to do it. Also, I think the relationship piece is really important. So I think there's a bit about relationships in there in terms of knowing people and being well connected. I mean, we know that makes connected communities resilient communities, but I think it's a really key point of people who can build back better and have the resilience to keep going are those who are very well connected. I think there's also, I don't want to say entrepreneurial, but I think it's kind of someone who has the opportunities, and they can see an opportunity, and they know, one, they have the means to do this, but they also can kind of go, there's a benefit to the community of my involvement, or the involvement of the people that I have around me, the resources, can lead to a significant benefit to the community, more so than if I just don't get involved. I think that's a really key point. I mean, I was going to say the work that we saw, and I was going to go over to this conference for the CERT teams in Missouri, but due to COVID couldn't go. But the teams over there, we spoke to them on the podcast in one of our earlier episodes. The work that they did, and they're all a group that's faith-based. I think the local church over there, they're all part of this CERT team, and they responded to the Joplin, Missouri tornado that went through, and they're obviously very tornado prone over there. But they just got together and they got all their resources together, and they just reacted to that. And people who weren't involved in that CERT group got involved through their networks, through churches, through social groups. So I think having those relationships was key to that. And then having the means and the networks and the opportunity to go, oh yes, I know this person has a bulldozer, for example, and I'll bring them in. And I know this person over here can do this. And I think there's that real sense of, it gives a sense of purpose. And as soon as they kind of get impacted by a disaster, they can take it one way or the other. But those who see sense of purpose and opportunity are the ones that really make a difference.
I think the common thread is that in any of those people, if you ask them before the fact whether they thought they would do that, they in a sense, and again, we talk a lot about the spontaneous volunteering. We say spontaneous volunteering, but when you talk to community members, like, oh, I just came out to help. I'm not a volunteer. I just came out to help. I think one common thread for me is that all of these individuals just find themselves in a circumstance at a point in time, and they help out. And I don't know. I don't think there's a secret special sauce, but it's just these people find themselves in these situations, and it's these people that rise to the challenge, as Andrew says, that tackle it head on. And it's inspiring, and that's something that we want to continue to do, is tell their stories to inspire others to get involved.
I think they know how, there's not, I think they don't know how to get involved. I think once they sort of learn that path, and it's someone else, they've seen it before. I think we've spoken to people, I can't remember exactly who it was, but People had seen this on the TV before, and they thought, I've seen people get involved after a disaster. I've seen people out there filling sandbags and hauling out fridges out of flooded properties or delivering meals to the firefighters. People who get involved in that element, who weren't personally impacted, are the ones that I find quite interesting, but they've often seen it from somewhere else and gone, oh, I should start a Facebook group because that happened somewhere else.
Yeah.
Or I've seen that, I need to prepare for this disaster. I've seen it happen somewhere else. I think the way we communicate and tell the stories actually inspires others, and it's really important we do that.
Yeah, to be honest, I think like when you turn on the news, it's sometimes hard to find some positivity about humanity. But I think one thing that we've really found throughout this whole podcast is that that light that's inside people, that human element will always come to the forefront. Like Sue Altman's a classic example of that in Thailand, an expat working over there, running a restaurant, and found herself smack bang in the middle of the Boxing Day tsunami, helping people, raising funds, counseling people. She tells a horrific story about a mum who's standing there, who's basically looking for her baby that she's lost, that was ripped out of her husband's arms during the tsunami. So it's these people that, they just find them, they've thrusted into these situations. But, some of their stories are just amazing, and there's things that we can learn about it.
Yeah, so those stories are the subject of our last question. Michael Player is asking, as curators, do you have further plans to package the key learnings so that they're easily accessed?
Oh, great question. And I think I see there in the thing, is this your day job? So no, this is not our day job. Andrew and I both work in the emergency management space. We've worked for many years in this space across all levels of government and across the entire disaster spectrum. And continue to do that. And this has really just been a passion project for us in the back end. But it's something that we're really committed to, and that's a great that is actually a great point that we might actually take away and have to give kudos to Michael in the future when we develop it, because I think that's the first step was the podcast, reducing barriers for people learning these stories and having access to them. But now that we're 3 years in, we're going to be starting our 4th season of the podcast later this year. There are a lot of learnings, and how we can kind of package those up again and create them as accessible, bite-sized pieces for people is going to be really important. There's also a range of other things that we're doing in the background that we won't talk about here today because it'd be too premature, but there are some things that we're going to be really excited to kind of launch through the podcast space around some tools and resources to help people as well around lessons that we've learnt for the sector. So watch this space for that in the coming months.
I will just add too that we're looking at, and you might have seen recently, if you're on our LinkedIn page or on the social media channels, we've tried to put on more sort of TikTok style videos to go. People don't always have the time as a 1 hour or 45-minute podcast, but they might have time to quick scroll a quick Facebook video. And that's where our recent guest, Daria Kraut, who's a doctor of leadership over in Western Australia, trying to package her sort of key lessons as bite-sized learnings to go, here's a 30-second video with the 3 key learnings. And the same sort of thing from Japan. And we go to Thailand, those sorts of things. So it's going, go listen to an infographic or a quick video.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Andrew and Josh. And thank you everyone for watching. We've had some great questions and terrific observations. So I think everyone's going to go away and watch the podcast now, listen to the podcast. The recording will be up on our website in a few days of today's session. Don't forget that it's getting very close to New Zealand Conference in October. So if you haven't booked by now, get onto it, because we do have limited seats at that venue. Details are on the website. Next webinar will be at the end of September. And we were to be hearing from Deputy Coordinator General of NEMA Australia, Joe Buffoni, but he's double booked us with his leave. And so we're hoping to get the Coordinator General, Brendan Moon. So hopefully he'll be able to fill Joe's boots. So we hope to see you all then. Stay safe and stay vocal. Bye.